Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Lana Sherman, and I'm a board member. The Network for Responsible Public Policy brings timely, facts-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Tonight's program will explore DOGE, What's Happening? Our moderator is Peter Coy, a freelance journalist covering economics, business, and finance. He has written for the Associated Press, Business Week, Bloomberg Business Week, and the opinion section of the New York Times. Tonight, Peter is joined by Algernon Austin. He has conducted research and written on issues of race and racial inequality for over 20 years. His current primary focus is on the low rate of employment in Black America and on using subsidized employment as a tool to address this problem. Also on our panel this evening is Jonathan Meyer. He is Senior Litigation Counsel at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a nonpartisan, nonprofit government watchdog that works towards accountability in government. Currently, he's leading a lawsuit against DOGE. John is also a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. Please visit our website to read more extensive bios of our presenters. As always, we will take audience questions. Please type your question into the Q&A box. A video of tonight's program will be available in the coming days on our website and our YouTube channel. Welcome to NFRPP. Peter, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Lana, for the great introduction. We're going to have a great panel tonight, and the concept is going to be that Algernon and Jonathan are going to make fairly brief presentations, 5 minutes or so each, and then we will go into questions. Some of them will be from me, and some of them will be from you, the audience. And I really want to encourage you, audience members, to, as Lana said, put your questions into the Q&A box. I'll get to as many of them as possible, because we don't really know what you might want to know about, and we want to be as responsive as possible, because this is a chance for interchange and education. And I'll start taking questions from the audience early on. I'm not going to wait till the end. So with that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Algernon. Please take it away.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm about to share my screen. I have a few opening remarks that I think will help frame the discussion for tonight. And I will begin with the title of this slideshow. DOGE is not about government efficiency. I think as we discuss DOGE tonight, it will become clear that this is in fact the case. The next point is that the United States is a very rich country. You know, depending on your metric, we're either the richest country in the world or one of the richest countries in the world. That means we can afford things. We can afford nice things. Collectively, we have a lot of money. The United States is not North Korea or Afghanistan or Haiti. We actually are very wealthy and can afford lots of things. So that's something to keep in mind in these discussions. You hear people talking as if we're, you know, this very poor country, but no, we're an incredibly wealthy country. But let's put that aside and say you want to significantly reduce the federal budget. And you can see here, this slide shows, you know, what the components of the federal budget is. You can see that health insurance makes up about 24% of spending, and that is Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and other types of health support. The next biggest category is Social Security, 21%. So those are, and then there's defense, 13%. Those are the big ticket items. You can look at this and decide if you wanted to reduce federal spending, where would you cut? What would you cut? What would you try to shrink down? And we know that DOGE focused on federal personnel, which is about 7% of the federal budget, the total federal budget. And we also know that they couldn't eliminate everyone who works in the federal government. So by focusing on that, they said, we're going to try to cut less than 7%. So it's a relatively small slice that was, the first thing on their agenda. Another thing that a lot of noise was made about was the USAID. USAID is 0.3 of 1%, an incredibly small piece of the federal budget. So I ask you to ask yourself, if your goal was, as Elon Musk originally said, to cut $2 trillion, would USAID be the first thing that you target? I know for myself, if I'm looking to reduce the federal budget, I would look at defense. And why? Because the US spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. So we could cut defense spending in half, and we would still spend more on defense than any of our closest rivals. The other way that DOGE, just the establishment of DOGE was an inefficient idea, is that we have the Government Accountability Office. And as this 2024 report shows, that every year they produce a report looking at how can we make government more efficient? How can we reduce fragmentation, overlap, duplication, and achieve billions of dollars in financial benefits? From that report, in 2024, they made 112 recommendations for improving government efficiency. Not all of their recommendations are adopted, but from 2011 to 2024, the adoption of their recommendations resulted in nearly $700 billion in reduced costs and increased revenue. So we already have, before DOGE, we already had a government office focused on efficiency. So why create DOGE? Was it about government efficiency, or was it about something else? And I'll stop there.
You're on mute, Peter.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Algernon, want to thank you very much. You made a lot of great points, and you also raised a lot of important issues that we will come back to. But for now, I want to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for hosting us, and thanks for everyone on this call. This is definitely a important issue that a lot of people are tracking from a lot of different angles, and I think mine is different than Algernon, the way that I have to think about this as part of my work. So I think that the key to understanding DOGE's past and future impact on the federal government really requires an understanding of what DOGE actually is and how it works. That's been challenging for us. It's been challenging for people who care about this, because the administration's tried in various ways to explain it differently. It is cast as a different thing in public forums than it is in litigation, when the government actually has to put the rubber to the road and explain what it's doing. And I think that's partly a intentional effort to avoid scrutiny of what DOGE is doing, what is it actually empowered to do. But I think it's also an indication of just how little thought and policy planning went into constructing the Department of Government Efficiency, which started as a Twitter meme, frankly, and kind of burst onto the scene literally created within hours of President Trump's second inaugural, and kind of burst onto the scene and started having serious impact on the functions of the government, though to Algernon's point, not actually saving any money or creating any actual efficiencies. The fact of the matter is DOGE itself is a component within the executive office of the president. President Trump, by executive order, has given it an enormous amount of power, but he's done so and kind of made it a nerve center for a lot of what's going on in the administration, without any real parameters, without any guidance. The founding document of DOGE as we know it is an executive order that commits it to pursuing the DOGE agenda without saying what the Doge agenda is. It is just there with this name, and its name drives its work. The result is that Doge's authority is wielded really unevenly, and really used, as Algernon already talked about, to target programs and policies that the administration are not a fan of, or that individual members of Doge are not a fan of. I think that one of the critical ways of understanding USAID is understanding who it was investigating and kind of what it's been pursuing. And suddenly, and predictably, that was targeted. At the same time, I think one of the challenges of understanding Doge is that the administration, both through Doge and sometimes not, is pursuing broader policies that are related to this kind of wider administration push to there are a lot of different ways to characterize it, but to shrink the size of the government, to reduce regulation. I mean, CFPB has been Doged, and there's a reason for that. And take other actions that, while people don't agree with them, don't suffer necessarily from the same kind of legal and proprietal problems that Doge itself does. So in other words, the administration is pursuing policies that I think we all think of and conceive of as being part of the Doge umbrella, while claiming that they're not actually part of the Doge agenda and the work that's going on. And a lot of the key to understanding Doge, and a lot of the confusion that we all have to grapple with, is understanding what is happening that we may not like, as a matter of essentially normal government policy, and what is, through the mechanism of Doge, being shoved through without proper consideration as required by law. But one thing I think that makes it challenging for everyone is that Doge and the administration are doing all of this under the mantle of eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. But there's no one in a position of responsibility and accountability who actually has defined those terms, or, as Doge is working, has been evaluating whether the programs that are being cut and the employees are being let go in any way are wasteful, conducted in fraud, or abusing their positions. I think one of the most telling characteristics of the way the administration and Doge is operating is that President Trump fired the inspectors general of about 13 different government agencies who, by congressional statute, by law, are required to pursue and root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think a lot of understanding how this is going to shake out, how it's shaken out so far, what Doge actions that have taken are going to eventually stand, depends on people's conception of waste, fraud, and abuse. Because one thing it does do immediately is it breaks up political opposition to what Doge is doing. Because what elected official is going to run the risk of saying, I'm actually not opposed to a government-wide effort to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, right? In theory, it's one of those things that I think has a lot of political support, and you saw that from Democrats on the Hill when Doge was announced. So I think their view and my view is the same, which is that half of the story with Doge is what it's doing, but the other half is how it's doing it, to understand its motivations and the legitimacy, both kind of ethically and legally, of what Doge is doing.
Jonathan, can you tell us exactly what you're alleging in your lawsuit?
Sure. So our lawsuit against Doge proper is under the Freedom of Information Act and the Federal Records Act. Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, I think most people are familiar with. It's a congressional mandate that executive agencies, and our litigation is about what it means to be an agency and whether Doge is one, are subject to public records requests. There's a very complicated and layered system for getting responses to FOIA requests. Crew filed one, I think 3 days after Doge was created, seeking a lot of information that's very basic, because at that point, I think people need to understand that Doge's predecessor was part of OMB. So we filed a FOIA request basically seeking information about what Doge's mandate was, who's running it, how it's been formed, planning documents, things like that, to the extent they're disclosable. And our other claim is a Federal Records Act claim. Very, very broadly, there are two main regimes that control the way that federal records have to be kept and maintained under federal law. One is the Federal Records Act that applies to the same set of agencies as FOIA. It's stricter. It gives the president far less control over what documents are kept and destroyed. Whereas the Presidential Records Act is for documents that really are owned and maintained by offices that are closely related to the president, and he has much more say in what goes on. So very broad strokes, our case is to force them to respond to our FOIA request, but also to get a declaratory judgment that DOGE is an agency under federal law, and it has to comply with FOIA and the FRA. And also, for instance, even though it's not part of our lawsuit, the Privacy Act, because there are a number of other federal statutes that use the same definition of agency. So we've been in a protracted fight with DOGE about discovery. The district court ordered them to give us discovery, insisted for depositions. They've taken it up to the Supreme Court once, and we kind of fought it to a draw. And now we've gotten another favorable ruling from the DC Circuit, and we're waiting for the government to go back to the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court has invited it to do.
Okay, I'm going to have some questions for Algernon, but I just want to follow up, Jonathan, on this, because I think the members of the general public, when they think about DOGE, they think, why are they cutting this? Why are they cutting that? And it's the substance of the cuts that they focus on. You're focused more on the methods, the legal structure, and so on. Why should that matter to a member of the general public? Why is your lawsuit important if you're just an average American taxpayer?
Sure. So it's important in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that kind of Crew was founded on and operates on the premise that visibility is good, right? That you can't evaluate what the government's doing behind a smoke screen. And it's extremely frustrating from my perspective to see DOGE post on its website every day and on its Twitter feed the cuts it's making and the cuts it's making. We're saving billions of dollars, which is inaccurate, but without understanding how it's working. The other thing that's really come to the fore in our litigation, though, which is really, really important, is what it means for an entity to be subject to FOIA and the FRA and an agency. Because the legal definition under FOIA that's kind of been carved out by the courts is if you have an entity like DOGE that's in the executive office of the president, attached to the executive office, that is only an agency if it wields substantial independent authority from the president. Basically, if it has the power to act on its own, to make binding government decisions, to direct agencies, it is an agency under the law. And what the government is arguing in our case is to determine whether DOGE is an agency, you don't look at what it's actually doing. You look at only what the president has put in the executive orders creating it. So their government's position in our case, which we obviously very much disagree with, is reality aside, DOGE only does what the president says it does in executive orders, and he can create it, he can order it to do whatever he likes, or it can take on a life of its own, which it absolutely has, but there's no transparency into it because of the way that it's described in the executive orders. So it's really just a matter of general, easiest conception of light and dark and understanding how this is all working.
All right, thanks very much. Now, Algernon, I'm going to read a question that came in from a member of the audience. And by the way, audience, please add questions to the Q&A. We really welcome them. This is a question that came to me too when I was listening to your presentation. So here it goes. You say we are a rich country. Does that justify waste, fraud, and abuse? Even rich people and rich businesses have budget and spending guidelines, and waste is never justified. Since the money is being paid by the people, don't you agree that it should be used responsibly? I certainly do not want my hard-earned money being wasted.
Yes, absolutely. There should not be waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's what the General Accountability Office is there for, to help. As I mentioned, their recommendations have led to significant savings. As Jonathan also mentioned, the inspectors generals are there to monitor agencies for waste, fraud, and abuse. If you're concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse, why do you fire, a dozen or more inspectors generals when you come into power? That does not seem to make sense. Are you really concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse? And let's look at, and also relating to what Jonathan is saying, why is this agency so opaque? Why is there so much confusion? We all were, it seemed pretty clear that for a while Elon Musk was running the agency, but the government said somebody else was running it. As Jonathan says, we don't know what's their definition of waste, fraud, and abuse. Everyone, they say they're saving this much money, and all of the press people, when they look at the numbers, they said, these things don't make any sense. They're not saving as much as they say. So why is there so much confusion and obfuscation and opacity around this agency? And furthermore, in the establishment of the agency, again, is this about efficiency? Let's think about Elon Musk was put at the head of this agency. He had 50 federal contracts with the federal government when he was given tremendous amount of power over the federal agency. So he got into conflict with cabinet secretaries because he was making decisions about cabinet agencies without consulting cabinet members. So he had tremendous power over the entirety of the US government, sending emails to everyone in every agency. But look, he has had 50 contracts with the government when he was put in power, and he was being investigated. There were 32 investigations of him by federal agencies. It doesn't make sense that that's the person you would put in so much power over the federal government. That is the classic Fox, being in charge of the hen house. He is put in power, and then all of a sudden, the State Department says it's going to purchase $400 million of his Cybertrucks. And then, of course, once this came out, then the purchase request disappeared. All the 32 federal investigations, they all came to a halt. Now, was he put in power over this agency because he gave, over $200 million to the Trump campaign? And for other reasons, he also got, his company got an FAA contract while he was, running DOGE. So even if you're concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse, you can certainly find someone without all the many conflicts of interest that Elon Musk has. Unless, of course, you're not really concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse, but you do want to create an environment that allows Elon Musk to avoid being investigated for federal violations, among other things.
Okay, so Jonathan, go ahead, and then
I
I
just
have
have
a question.
one thought in response to that question I think is important to understand is, we're talking about waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think fraud and abuse are definitional things that, if they are true, are never, there's no subjectivity to them. One thing I think is important for people to understand is the way that the concept of waste is being defined. Waste is being defined largely by just identifying policy prerogatives that the administration doesn't like, right? So just as an example, foreign aid, right? Trump and his political supporters believe that far too much is being paid in foreign aid. So they refer to all of it and what US aid is doing as waste. The problem with that conceptually and legally, and this is a big legal fight that's going on across the country, is that the people through Congress, the people of the United States through Congress, have decided that that money should be spent, right? So it has already appropriated funds and directed them into pockets. I mean pockets in a good way to deserving entities. And the same is true with the public parks system. Like this is not only money being spent overseas, but I think that's a key thing to understand. Is a lot of the push and pull here is there's something. I mean, there are legal mechanisms whereby a president can, under limited circumstances, refuse to spend money that Congress has appropriated, but they are few and far between. And the Trump administration has basically taken the position that forget what Congress has decided and what the federal law requires in terms of spending. It is waste if the current administration doesn't agree with it. And I just think that's a conceptual thing that people really need to understand how this is going.
And can I just quickly piggyback on that? So just to make concrete what Jonathan said, so President George W. Bush started a program to combat AIDS. Very successful program, saved millions of lives, I believe. That was defined by DOGE as wasteful spending. Now we can debate, whether we want to spend that money, but I think it's hard to really justify when people think of waste. That's not what people think of. It's like they don't like the program, and that's fair. They could not like it. But just to illustrate that they're basically anything they don't like USAID, they don't like the AIDS program, they call it waste. So we have to be highly suspect of anything they say that is waste, fraud, and abuse. It needs further investigation because we're seeing that they're extremely loose with the use of those terms.
Algernon, I'll offer an amendment to your slide and see what you think. I'm just curious. To me, the argument that we are a rich country is a good argument if what you're trying to do is explain why we need to have USAID, why we need to spend on SNAP, why we need to have Social Security and so on. It's not an argument for why we don't need to worry about waste, fraud, and abuse, but it's kind of the way you structured the slide is like, well, why are you bringing up the fact that we're a rich country as a preface to talking about waste, fraud, and abuse? It just strikes me as like you're opening yourself up to the criticism that the one speaker had, which is that you're seeming to excuse waste, fraud, and abuse, which I don't think is your point.
No. But there is, I mean, the other thing, we have been cutting government for probably from the Brennan Center did an analysis, and they found that the majority of cabinet agencies actually have fewer staff. It was from 2010 to 2022. Most of them had fewer staff in 2022 than they had 2010. This, I would call it ideology, that we spend too much and government is too big, has led, even before DOGE, to this significant reduction in staffing of the federal government. An important thing to look at is the IRS. Now, the IRS does not make tax law. They enforce tax law. They are essentially the tax police. And we have, for not just this period, but DOGE has been aggressive, and the current administration has been aggressive. But we have been essentially defunding the tax police. And what happens, there are fewer IRS people working at the IRS now than in 1992, although, of course, the population has grown significantly. And what all the analysis shows is when you have inadequate staffing, and the IRS is also using like software and technology from the 1970s, right? When you have inadequate staffing of the IRS, the government collects less revenue. So we have bigger deficits. By starving the IRS, we have bigger deficits because we collect less revenue. We collect less revenue because the millionaires and the billionaires have very complicated tax returns, And you need more staff and you need skilled staff to police those individuals. So when DOGE, the Treasury Department, said that the cuts that DOGE has implemented on the IRS will lose us about $500 billion each year. So we're rich. If we adequately fund the IRS, we will have less tax cheating by the wealthy. We will have less, we will have therefore have more revenue, and our budget deficits will go down. So yes, we are in fact a very wealthy country, and we can afford a lot of things. And ironically, this desire to shrink government, particularly the IRS, makes us poorer because it enables more tax evasion by the wealthiest individuals. So we really have to break out of this mindset that we're a poor country and we can't afford things. We can afford a lot more. We can, another thing that DOGE cut, the EPA made investments to this small community. Their sewer systems were backing up in this community. The EPA finally made some investments to help this community so that their aging infrastructure, and you can look at the infrastructure report cards, we get, I think, our C grade. Why does the richest country in the world have a C grade for infrastructure? It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, DOGE, because this was a grant to a low-income community or a minority community, they called it waste. This is waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, you can't. You have to be highly suspect of what they label, and also we should not have a C graded infrastructure by the American Society of Civil Engineers. We are a rich country. We don't deserve a C infrastructure.
So I think you both made a very important point there, which is that just because you call it waste doesn't mean it's really waste. And so one thing I think a lot of people are interested in, certainly I am, is what's going on like today, because we think of DOGE as being something from last spring. Is it still, what's happening now? One question I have is whether it's true that people who came in through DOGE are now embedded in the different agencies, and if so, how they are affecting what goes on inside those agencies. And there's a question from William Arnone here. What is the current status of DOGE's access to personal data at the Social Security Administration and the IRS? So maybe I'll start with Jonathan on that, and then if Algernon, you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I'm going to try to answer it in two ways. One of them is, I think substantively, in terms of what DOGE is still doing, it is the same as it was in May. It just is at, I think, lower visibility and lower rates, right? I think they tried to make a splash as quickly as they could by canceling as many contracts as they could, canceling as many grants as they could, and on paper, reducing staff as much as they could. Today there were Republicans on the Hill assuring everyone that DOGE is still working, even though Elon Musk is gone, and he's right. The data question is extremely concerning. From the very beginning, DOGE had and relatively, well, not relatively, actually did simply demand access to data at the Social Security Administration, at the Office of Personnel Management, at Treasury, at USAID, to try to, I think they were trying to do two things. They were trying to get their hands on the actual modalities by which federal money is spent, that is to control Treasury accounts and control spending accounts. And number two, I think, is to collect that data. The public reporting and information for people who have left the government is that data is being used there are reports of data breaches, so it's entirely possible that citizen data has made its way into the hands of private companies for whatever purpose they may, surreptitiously use it later. It's also being used and compiled in a very troubling way for voter scrutiny, right? It's an attempt to take SSA data and other independent data compiled on American citizens. And essentially what's happening is they're distributing it to the states so that the states can try to use it to challenge voter registrations and purge voter rolls for communities and people that they don't want voting. So it is still very much in full swing. Another thing that's happening, and this is one of those things that, I think in the abstract, people may, in the long run, and a large part of the United States population might agree with. But they're also, whether it's through DOGE or through separate administrations, just continuing not only with contract termination, but contract kind of pressure and review. Government contractors are being contacted and basically saying, justify your spend because we've demonstrated our willingness to terminate. So they're trying to get extractions that way. The other half of the answer is something that I didn't really touch on when I was speaking at the beginning, but structurally how all of this is working. People need to understand that there's the entity, the United States DOGE service, but the same executive order that created that also created what are called DOGE teams at every federal agency. They are groups of at least 4 people that consist of a lawyer, a logistician, a tech person, and I can't remember what the 4th one is, excuse me, but they are installed at these agencies to pursue the same goal that DOGE itself is, which is implementing the DOGE agenda, whatever that means. One thing that our litigation has been focused on, because it really goes to the questions of whether DOGE is an agency under FOIA and the FRA, and one of our big points of dispute is, okay, are these DOGE agencies actually driving the bus? Or I'm sorry, are these DOGE teams actually driving the bus at these agencies with DOGE's agenda rather than the agencies actually in good faith operating on their own, which is what's legally required? And the other thing that we need more information on as a country, because in other litigation it has kind of come out that these DOGE teams and DOGE are the same small group of people that are still there. They are not the Elon Musks and Steve Davises of the world. They are other people who are associated with them who may be employees formally of the Office of Personnel and Management, but they also have a role at DOGE, and they also have a role at HHS, and they also have a role in Interior. So I think the short answer to that is DOGE is still doing what it was doing before, just not with as large, splashy contract cancellations as it did. And I think now they are dug in a way that they weren't 6 months ago.
I take myself off mute. I wrote something about DOGE for my New York Times newsletter, saying that the biggest problem with DOGE is that the DOGE people really didn't know what they were doing. That the good thing about GAO is that they spend months and years embedding themselves in these agencies and really getting to understand line by line what their budgets are, and the way that enabled them to detect where the waste, fraud, and abuse really was. Whereas if you just come in first week or even first month from the job, you don't have the knowledge that enables you to do that. And so what you fall back on is just chopping off a certain percent of an agency. And I still believe that's the case, but I'm going to ask Jonathan this first. You said that they're embedding in these agencies. Is it possible, and maybe I'll ask Algernon on this too, that they are gaining that kind of knowledge that the GAO inspectors have had so that they can start making smarter cuts and actually doing legitimate savings? What's your thought on that? And I want to ask you both that question. Let's give Algernon the first crack on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So, but this is the thing. I mean, your point, it gets exactly at it. It's that this is not efficient, right? You have the GAO already. Every year they produce reports, start there. What they did was the GAO does not exist. We're going to randomly cut people, and then, oops, we actually need to rehire. We realize now that we need to rehire those people that we just fired. And then, many of those people say, I don't like this work environment. So even people that you try to rehire then take early retirement. So all of that is incredibly inefficient, incredibly badly management. All of that is wasteful government spending, right? That is wasteful. But right now, DOGE has introduced a significant amount of inefficiency in government because they've understaffed people, they've understaffed agencies, offices, they've understaffed offices, they've lost key personnel, and now they're reshuffling people. When the Social Security Administration, they have people who are analysts and administrators, and they've lost people, sort of frontline people, uh, uh, dealing with claims. So now they're moving administrators and analysts into claims positions because they don't have enough people doing claims work, but they're overwhelmed. So the people who are supposed to be doing claims have to train these new people. They don't have enough time to train these new people. So you have all these people in these positions that they weren't trained for, trying to do the job. It's incredibly inefficient. So again, this is not a rational, efficient way to do any type of government reform. Um, it's just yes, it doesn't it's just not about efficiency.
Okay. Jonathan, anything to say on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that I think the structure of the Doge teams is telling in the terms of their ability to kind of get up to speed. You know, GAO, I don't know. I guess the presumption might be that anyone can do any work at any time, right? But GAO is full of pros. OIG offices are full of pros. They've made careers of doing this. They know how to do it. And I think it's telling that the Doge teams that were installed by executive order don't require any knowledge of the agency they're working for, right? The Department of Education's Doge team, there's no requirement that that a person is qualified on education policy or has any knowledge. It's they send in lawyers and they send in engineers, right? I don't think that it's possible for teams that size to do anything other than, at best, listen to a small amount of information and process it, right? These are huge government functions that are supposedly being funneled into a very small group of people who, like I said, in many cases work for 3, 4, 5 agencies at a time.
And can I just add one other point in terms of how the problems they're creating in the two more points in the functioning of the government because they're so concerned in limiting spending. They have now added a bureaucracy. So there was a report that air traffic controllers, they're surrounded by these big windows, have to go through several steps to get someone to clean the window because DOGE is so concerned that no one spend any penny that they don't approve. So the people who normally could say, "Hey, we need the window washed," now have to make sure that it goes up the chain 2 or 3 steps before they could allocate money to get the window washed. So they're introducing, that's another inefficiency that they introduce into the system. They've made it much more bureaucratic. The other thing is that it's so bad that I worry about the future workforce. when people look, people who may have thought, oh, I want to serve the American people, I want to work in the federal government. When they see the chaos that's going on there, they're going to change their minds. So we're not going to get sort of dedicated public servants in the federal government. And that's a real harm, that an additional harm that DOGE is doing.
Okay. I'm still getting a bunch of questions from people who are getting the impression, which I think is false, that the two of you are not sufficiently concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse. One of them said, and this is Al Smith, I suggest the speaker look at the website of the Citizens Against Government Waste. When you see the ridiculous programs and projects that have been approved, makes no sense. Do you think this isn't waste and abuse? Either one of you want to take that? And to answer the broader question of how do you criticize DOGE without seeming to be excusing waste, fraud, and abuse? How do you position that?
Right. Yes. No, I'm a taxpayer. I don't want waste, fraud, and abuse. I kind of called out the Defense Department. I think there's probably waste, fraud, and abuse in the Defense Department. To give you an example of a place that I think I would love to see, the Defense Department has failed all their audits. So that's where, as I mentioned, that's where I would start. Yes, the federal government is massive. Of course, somewhere there's waste, fraud, and abuse. No question about that. And we should be concerned about this. But again, we have the Government Accountability Office. We have the Inspectors General. If we have mechanisms in place, and the fact that DOGE kind of disregards those mechanisms, or with the Inspectors General gets them fired, DOGE is, I am not convinced that DOGE is concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse. They have not been transparent. There have been, under the Clinton administration, there was significant reductions in the federal workforce. And there were no massive amounts of lawsuits and controversy because they followed a clear procedure with input and with transparency. DOGE is incredibly opaque. Assessing exactly how much waste, fraud, and abuse is very difficult, but that's why I rely on the experts, the Government Accountability Office and the Inspectors General. And they do reports, like I said, I started off, they were able to produce nearly 700 billion in savings over a period of years. So yes, we can be more efficient, and I support the General Accountability Office in their efforts to make the government more efficient. I support the inspectors generals who were fired in making the government more efficient. DOGE, unfortunately, does not support these mechanisms to make the government more efficient.
Jonathan, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't. I think I agree with all of that. I think, and this is something I said at the top, when DOGE was announced and its mission was announced, there were plenty of Democrats on the Hill who they didn't take a stance against DOGE because waste, fraud, and abuse is bad. Cutting extra spending is a good thing if we don't need it. But to Algernon's point and my point earlier, saying stuff that things are waste, fraud, and abuse don't make them so. Mathematically, it's just an ironclad mathematical fact that federal government spending was higher in the first half of this year than it was before. It hasn't had that effect. People have to be hired back. So, it's very easy, I think, and I think it's an intentional design. It's frankly, I'll give credit where credit's due. Good politics, I think, right? To say that everything that you don't like is waste, fraud, and abuse. There have to be mechanisms to identify it. The other thing I think we all need to remember is, Algernon's talking about how wealthy the United States is, and that's true. But so much of governing is about priorities. It is, where are you going to put your priorities? Are we scrutinizing, spending government funds and kind of committing the idea of waste, fraud, and abuse to rooting out, you know, spending that's already been vetted and approved by Congress, rather than, to Algernon's point, closing out tax loopholes, going after, people who violate, market regulations and kind of profit off of the backs of people. It's all prioritization, and I think that it's just not a particularly credible thing to say, because Doge is not conducting this in a really reasonable way, and that's a problem, that people need to turn a blind eye and say, as long as someone says they're pursuing waste, fraud, and abuse, they are doing the right thing. Algernon already made a very salient point about government offices being closed that have open investigations of political supporters. I mean, it is fact.
Okay, we're coming up on 8:30. I'm going to probably try to wrap it then, but I want to make sure everybody gets your questions in now so I can get them asked. I'm not going to be able to ask every question, but there are some good ones that are still on the list. So actually, the first question that came in, I'd like to go back to it. It has to do with Peter Thiel and Palantir, and his early involvement in Doge. Can you tell me, either of you, what's going on with that?
I'm not particularly comfortable kind of guessing as to what's going on there. I mean, I think part of that is this the data scrapes that we were talking about, that I don't see as at all related to waste, fraud, and abuse, as long as we're talking about kind of that topic. And there are allegations that data has been put out to essentially been fed into AI systems. I don't know more than's been publicly reported, so I don't want to opine on that too much without knowing.
Okay, another question came in. Who are the named plaintiffs in your lawsuit against Doge?
It is Just Crew.
Okay,
Yep.
fine, straightforward.
Yep.
Now, one of the ways that Doge got around some of the layoff rules of the government was by putting people on extended leave, but still paying them. Was that legal, and is it still going on?
So I'm not an employment lawyer, but I will say, so the dispute about that is, look, I think that there are a lot of things that people may not like that the president or the government are able to do. The allegations, the legal claims that have been brought by various groups have claimed that that's a violation of civil service rules. One of the big problems that we have is that the Merit Systems Review Board, which is the agency that's supposed to be reviewing adverse employment decisions for federal employees, including placing people on leave, has essentially been gutted, and its internal counsel has basically said, we're not going to grant kind of the relief that people are seeking. There are also claims in there regarding whether that's legal under collective bargaining agreements with unions. My suspicion is that at least the determination to put people on leave is probably legal. That, as I said, I'm not a lawyer. It's definitely still happening. And I think it's also, kind of a good example of the inefficiencies that we're talking about, because a very large number of federal employees have been paid for months to do nothing.
Yeah, I mean, you could call it wasteful spending.
Yeah, get it. Yeah.
And on that point, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has saved the American people $21 billion, avoiding financial scams and other sort of bad financial practices. How does ending the CFPB help the American people? It may help certain corporations, but I don't see it as helping the American people.
Okay.
So again,
Yeah.
what is the point of DOGE? Is it to help the American people or to help particular corporations or particular individuals?
Right. Now, we have several questions, all making the same point, which is that there is a lot of waste in government. Al Smith mentions the late Senator, I guess Tom Coburn wrote the debt bomb. We have an anonymous attendee talking about Social Security recipients who are getting paid when they shouldn't. We have somebody complaining that the education department must not be doing a good job when math and verbal scores are falling. So I'm going to, rather than ask you to address each particular agency, ask a broader question, which is, okay, if you don't like DOGE, but you still feel like there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, does that mean that maybe we should be strengthening the GAO, for example, building up its ranks, giving it more so it can do more research, or should we be strengthening the inspectors general? What should we be doing if we don't think DOGE is a good idea? I'll ask you both that question.
Yeah, so you hear there are a lot of individual stories being circulated, and you may hear it repeated a lot, but we're a very big country. We have a big government. It's useful to have some clear numbers of like, is this a couple of cases, or is this are we talking about 1% of this sort of misallocation of Social Security? Are we talking 50%? What's the number? Where's the source of this information? So I think it's really helpful, just like DOGE can label anything it wants, waste, fraud, and abuse. We really need to get good information. So yes, absolutely. I think relying more heavily on the GAO, and really, I think maybe publicizing some information, like when people make claims about Social Security, really publicizing information, analyses of this. Social Security has dramatically reduced poverty in the United States. It is our largest anti-poverty program. The Census Bureau said that reported just this month, 29 million Americans were lifted out of poverty. So I think we really need, given the many millions of people who receive Social Security, we really need hard data to assess to what extent there may be any type of waste, fraud, and abuse in Social Security. It's easy in a country of so many millions, it's easy to find one example or even a handful of examples of people doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and then repeating those examples, over and over again. We need data on, the millions of Social Security recipients that will evidence, not just throwing labels around, but evidence. What extent is this a problem? Or has someone who doesn't like Social Security program, who wants to reduce their Social Security tax payments, just selected a few items and publicized it?
Okay, Jonathan, anything to say on this again? What should we be doing if it's not DOGE?
I think it's helpful to separate waste, fraud, and abuse into at least two buckets. There's fraud and abuse, and I think Algernon's right that the GAO helps identify a lot of that. But as kind of we've been talking about, offices of Inspector General are designed to root that out from the government side, right? To identify when conduct occurs within agencies, that is fraudulent, that is abusive of government resources and things like that. Obviously, law enforcement, though, has a very large part to play here, right? There's two sides to the coin. So, I mean, I think there's been over time, just as a matter of kind of staffing, laxed genuine enforcement of anti-fraud provisions. Entitlements are an immensely important part of kind of the American fabric, but they are also, you know, places where people can take advantage of things. So I think that genuine enforcement of fraud and waste laws are really helpful. On the waste side, I think a lot of it, waste is a harder thing to talk about because it's a value judgment, right? In the abstract, I think my problem with DOGE is kind of the labeling of things as waste, even though federal law requires them to operate. You know what I mean? But if people are concerned about waste, they should get more and more and more and more and more involved in elective politics. Make sure their voices are heard, because that is what drives the spending in the United States is acts of Congress appropriating funds, right?
Yeah.
So if you're concerned, it's a value judgment. If someone is concerned that, the defense budget is wasteful because it's funding things that are unnecessary, that's a political kind of representative choice that people need to pursue. If you think that that's not wasteful at all, but foreign aid is wasteful or education spending is wasteful, I think the key is understanding what these programs are actually doing, right? And getting to the root of it. And that's a long answer in terms of the amount of time that change takes. But waste in and of itself is a political, kind of policy judgment that has to be addressed that way.
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to ask Lana Sherman to come on in just a second, but I think we've aired a lot of important issues here, and I've tried to answer as many questions as I could. Even if I didn't answer your individual question, I tried to lump it in with some other questions. So I hope people are satisfied that they learned what they came to learn. Huge thanks to both Algernon Austin and Jonathan Mayer for coming on and talking to us. I learned a lot and hope everybody else did too. Lana, over to you.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much to all of our presenters tonight. Thanks for sharing your expertise with our audience, and we hope you all come back again. To our audience, we'd love to hear from you as to your opinions from our discussions and what actions you are taking in your community. You can email us at info@nfrpp.org. Please join us for our next program, which will be on crypto. That'll be on Thursday, October 23rd. Thanks to all and good night.
Good night.